I'm Luke Clancy and I'm an independent radio producer with SoundsDoable in Ireland. We're out in the back garden of the Coconut Court Hotel on the beach in Barbados, just a little bit south of Bridgetown, I think. One of the things that brought us here, I suppose, was Mark O'Callaghan, the son of the author of a very interesting book about Barbados, To Hello Barbados, which became, quite synonymous with the Irish in Barbados. Actually, also the title of a Damien Dempsey LP, of course, is where he took the title from. And Mark was coming here to bring some documents to the archives that his father wrote the book To Hello Barbados about the earliest people coming to Barbados as indentured servants, a lot of them from Ireland, and it sort of traces the history of those people. But one of the interesting things is that we met so many Barbadians many Bajans, I think is the correct term, who actually said that they had read the book and they had no Irish connections, and they had read the book and found that it told them things about their own island that they didn't know before, gave a view of life in the 17th century that they hadn't heard, and they were quite interested to learn that and quite moved by it, even though the subject was mainly Irish indentured servants rather than chattel slaves from Africa. One of the great things was an introduction to Ronnie Carrington, who's a man that is known all over the island, so everywhere he stops, somebody hugs him behind their mask. But he's also a fantastic source of knowledge of the island and a great way to learn, to actually get some shape or sense of the island that you can't get by reading or even just walking on your own. He finds the little corners and adds the anecdote to the corners that's quite extraordinary. And he's a very, very special individual with very special kind of communication gifts, but a lot of knowledge that he's very happy to share. He is a kind of live documentary rather than a tour guide, I felt, so that the kind of psychogeography of the island was as present as, this is a nice swimming spot. In fact, this is a nice swimming spot is not of interest to him. What happened to that steel factory and the sugar factory that preceded it and the planning around that's of interest. And I think that's kind of interest to a lot of people who visit the island, some sense of something other than a holiday island. One of the people that Ronnie introduced us to was a woman called Esther Phillips, who is Barbados's first poet laureate. She's now also Barbados's second poet laureate because her term has been extended, and writes the most beautiful and painful poetry about the legacy of slavery in the island and the silence around her family and their experiences and the kind of way that what happened on the island that is shocking and shameful was not communicated down through her family, and she's kind of trying to resurrect the voices of people who were silenced on the island. And we had a wonderful time in her back garden with her reading some of her poems on this subject. Very kind of conflicted time because we were the poems are quite beautiful and she's a beautiful reader of her own work. But the work itself is exposing, the most terrible of atrocities. The Celtic Festival is quite a strange thing because, as we discovered with Sean O'Callaghan's book, there is a lot of people who came to the island from the Celtic countries, from Scotland and from Ireland and indeed from Wales. And their presence, in the contemporary Barbados is quite strong. But they have a sense of their history, and that's in this rather strange pageant of the Celtic Festival, which has people marching down the centre of Bridgetown in kilts and led by bagpipers in the blazing sun. It's not quite the attire for Barbados, the kilts, but they do it to kind of commemorate the kind of historical links between Scotland and Ireland and Barbados. And of course they ended up in the square that was established to welcome in the announcement of the Republic, which has a fantastic monument to kind of rival the Vietnam Monument in Washington DC, which is a curved wall of terracotta bricks, and into each of them are carved hundreds of different names of families who have shown up in the records on Barbados. And it seemed like everybody in our party could find their family, no matter where they actually came from. Well, I think realistically they would like people to feel that there is a connection between our cold islands up in the north and this lovely island here. And I mean, it's reasonable they need foreign income so they can make people feel at home. And of course there are in contemporary Ireland a lot of people, a lot of Irish people who've set up businesses famously in places like Sandy Lane, and you know, there's a strong Irish contingent even now, but to kind of point to the history of that I think is interesting, and I suppose makes people think about, register it as a place they might go and see what those connections mean. We went up to St. Nicholas Abbey, which is one of the remaining kind of rum distilleries that I think is kind of actually re-energized quite recently. But there was a gentleman, Winston Gill, who was sitting in the garden looking after the animals, and I mentioned to him that we were talking about this book, To Hello Barbados, and he went over to his pickup truck, reached into the back seat and took out a copy of To Helen Barbados, and was talking about how moved he was by the stories told in the book. It didn't particularly matter to him that these were Irish people that were taken here. It seemed to him they were his ancestors, his predecessors on the island as well. I mean, all of that stuff, I was entirely convinced that people do feel the kinship with all sorts of people who came here. I mean, it's only anecdotal evidence, but I definitely did find those people. It's a much richer kind of cultural scene than you could possibly do in a few days. So actually, I'm going to stay on here a little bit longer. I keep meeting people giving me the anecdote about how they were here for a week and they're 20 years later running this business. But there's a lot more of the cultural scene in Barbados to be explored. So even this time, I'm going to stay a little bit longer.